Hey everyone, Steve from Backcountry Gallery again, coming to you once again from the BCG mobile headquarters that is my camper. This is video 3, and this time we are going to look at the first half of the custom setting menu in the Nikon Z6iii. I'm going to show you how to set all of the different settings right up till we get to the controls section, and then that's going to go into the next video. As I've said before, make sure that you sign up for that free email newsletter at my site because I have my complete wildlife setup guide for the Z6iii coming out. And once again, I just can't emphasize this enough, we are only scratching the surface of what you're going to learn in that guide. One of the most important things with that guide isn't so much that you're going to see these same similar settings, it's that you're going to have more application in the field, how to use these settings. Not just how to set them or maybe a couple ideas why, but you're going to get a lot more application for using these settings and applying them and getting the most from the camera. So I hope you'll check that out and grab that email newsletter so you know what it comes out to. And again, that should be out sometime in September is what we're going for. And as a reminder, if you're coming to this video going, hey, where's videos 1, 2, and 4? Guess what? They're in the description area here on YouTube. So make sure you check those out. Let's jump in. Okay, so let's dive into our custom setting menu there. That is the one with a little pencil. Our first option is to reset the custom setting menu, just like our photo shooting menu. If you've suspect that you've made some kind of a major error in here and you just want to start over, go in here, and this is your reset button right here. I'm not going to do that right now because I just reset it so I can show you this setup guide. So we're going to go to the focus menu first, and our very first item is AFC Priority Selection. Let's leave that at the default of release. The only reason I'm actually bringing this up is sometimes people get tempted to try the focus and release or focus options, and focus plus release, the idea is that it's going to make sure it has a sharp initial photo as you're focusing on whatever subject it is, and then after that it's just basically in release mode. And the truth is that is very hit and miss. I find that sometimes that just lets you release anyway, even if you're not sharp with that first photo, so I don't see a lot of benefit to that particular mode. The other one is focus, and that's the one that can throw people off sometimes because they say, hey, that sounds good. I don't want the camera to take a photo unless it's in focus, right? And that sounds good in theory. But in reality, what happens is, let's say you have a bird flying by and you're panning along and you're shooting. Unless the camera can confirm that it has a focus lock on each and every one of those shots as you're shooting, it won't fire. So if you're pressing the button and it can't confirm it has a lock, it's not going to fire. And the problem is, sometimes, even if it can't confirm a lock, it actually still is sharp. It still has a lock. So you miss all of those shots. So I go ahead and leave this on release. Every shot you've seen from me from the last 20, 30 years, whatever, has been shot in AFC release mode. So I highly recommend leaving it on there if you're a wildlife photographer because this is where you want to be. This works really, really well. And you don't miss any of those in focus but not confirmed shots that you would in focus or focus plus release. Next is AFS Priority Selection. As a wildlife photographer, I don't use AFS. I just leave this at the default of focus. It works fine in AFS mode. Next, we have focus tracking with lock on, and let me tell you, this one generates a little bit of confusion, and people are always trying to figure out how to set it. So let me explain what this does. So if we go in here, we see block shot AF response. So basically what this is asking you, if there's a drastic change in distance under the AF area, basically something is blocking the subject or maybe you're off the subject. If it sees that drastic change in distance under that AF area that you're using, how long should it wait before it tries to refocus? That's all this is. That's all this is asking. So for example, let's say you're tracking along with a bird and that bird flies behind a tree because they do stuff like that. This is basically saying, should it immediately try to focus on that tree when it senses that change in distance? Or should it hold on for a second so that bird can emerge from the other side and still be able to, you can still pick it back up. So that's what this is going to do. The other thing this does that's kind of handy, it's not really a block shot, but let's say you're tracking a bird, you're trying to pan along with a bird and you're maybe not doing a great job at it. We all have been there, right? And the bird's in and out of the AF area and you're not doing, maybe your job as well as you should be. Okay, it happens. So basically, when that AF area goes to the background or the sky, how long should the camera wait? Should it immediately try to refocus or should it hang on for a second and let you regain it? That's what this is setting. Delayed is going to wait longer and quick is going to be almost instant. And neither of these are slow. Okay, both of these are pretty darn fast when they happen. But delayed does give you this extra little bit of time there to kind of get back on sometimes. And ostensibly, it seems like delayed might be the way to go, right? Because it seems like you'd always want to be at 5 because you want the camera to give you as much time as possible to get back on the subject. But that is not the case because I'm sure you've been in a situation where you're trying to photograph a bird in flight and the camera inadvertently grabs onto the wrong thing, or you're tracking the bird and it grabs onto something else that's incorrect. And you get back on the bird, it's under the AF point, you're pressing the AF on button or the half pressing the shutter release as hard as you can, trying to get the camera to get back on that subject, and it's just waiting and waiting and waiting. That's because there's a longer delay in here, and it's waiting for that delay to expire before it attempts to refocus. In that case, quick is your friend. The faster you're refocusing, the better off you are. So it gets right back on the subject in those situations. So it's not a set it and forget it setting, because this is going to be situational. Sometimes I find it a little bit faster is helpful, and sometimes a little bit longer is helpful. It just depends on what I'm shooting. And I do go over this much more extensively with much better examples in the guidebook that's coming up in September. But for right now, this kind of gives you a starting point here. And basically the bottom line is this. If you find the AF point is falling off your subject way too easily, go for a longer delay. If you find the AF point seems to be too sticky, like it gets stuck on things and it's not letting go easy enough, go a little bit faster. I usually start around 3, and most of the time that's actually okay. But there are times I come in here and I make it quicker, or I go for a longer delay, again, depending on if the AF point area is feeling too sticky or too loose. So that's how you do this. And one more note here. I'm sorry, this is a really in-depth topic with this focus tracking with lock-on. And again, the book probably covers it better than I can here in the video. But the other thing is subject detection. Because what people don't understand about subject detection a lot of times is subject detection is a refinement of your AF area, and it takes over for that AF area when it's active. So if you're in wide AF, maybe you're like wide large and you're tracking a bird and you see subject detection take over and that little green box goes around the face, hopefully, and you're tracking along. Right at that moment, subject detection is actually what's making the decisions. Wide is just kind of in the background. It's not really doing anything. Subject detection is essentially your AF area, your AF mode at that time. Now what happens is if as you're tracking, a tree comes between you and the bird, what's going to happen is subject detection is no longer going to see a subject. And when that happens, subject detection reverts back to whatever AF area, it hands over control to whatever AF area was being used before it took over. In this case, wide. So at that point, wide is going to immediately try to focus. So this setting really isn't going to do much with subject detection on, because if subject detection loses the subject, it's not going to wait. It's going to transfer that control back to your primary AF area. Again, in this case, in our example, wide. And wide is going to immediately start to try to focus on something. So this is basically for those times you're not using subject detection, but you're just tracking with the normal AF area. That's when you're going to see this at its most effective. That's when you're going to really notice it. If you're using subject detection, this is not really going to make much of a difference one way or the other. So hopefully that makes sense. And let's finally move on. Next, we have focus points used, and thankfully this is an easy one. This just lets us use all points or alternating points. Sometimes alternating points are a little bit quicker to kind of move around that viewfinder. All points, on the other hand, gives you more precision. I leave it on all points because a lot of times I use single point AF, and basically I'm making a composition. I'm moving my AF point to the eye, and I want that extra little refinement there. So I leave that at the default, but in case you're wondering what that was. Store points by orientation. Most of the time I leave this off, but there's a couple options. Focus point and AF area. Basically what this is going to do is it's going to record the focus point position. That's what focus point means. Or it's going to record the focus point position and AF area, and it's going to do that based on the orientation of the camera. So if you're horizontal, for example, and you're in wide large, and you put that in the center of the frame, the camera's tracking that the whole time you're doing it. So when you do that, the camera knows that when you're in horizontal at that moment, that the wide large area is right in the middle of the frame, and it knows that if you're on the focus point and AF area, we'll use that as our example, and it knows which AF area mode you're using. Now let's say you flip the camera vertical, and you say, hey, in the vertical orientation, I'm going to change the position and move it all the way up, and I'm going to go to single point AF. Okay, so now you're vertical, and you can picture it there. You have your single point AF there, up at the top of the frame. And you flip it back. If this is on focus point and AF area mode, it's going to switch back to wide large when you do this and put it back in the center. And when you do this, it's going to go to single point and put it at the top. This confuses the heck out of people because they set it and then they forget that they've set it, and they can't understand why when they're flipping their camera, their AF areas and positions are all over the place. But that's what this does. And if you're wondering why the heck you'd use it, here's an example. Let's say you're photographing some birds in flight. You want horizontal, maybe you're using wide large and you're tracking them as they go by. But there's a beautiful egret just to the side. and you're like, oh, I want to do some vertical shots and I want to use single point AF and just focus right on his eye as I'm doing it. So then as you're photographing him, you're like, oh, that's beautiful. I'm taking this picture. He looks really nice. Oh, look, a bird in flight. Boom. You're in wide and centered up, ready to go. That's why you use it. But most of the time, it causes more confusion than anything else. So I leave it off. But I did want to let you know that it's there because I do use this sometimes. And sometimes it is very handy in that type of scenario. So I'm going to keep that off for now. AF activation on is how this is set currently. I want to go in here and put AF on only. This is basically going to enable back button focus. This is going to disable shutter release focus, and it's going to let me use my back button focus. And as you know, if you've been following me for any amount of time, I'm a big raving fan of back button focus. Focus point persistence, we're going to leave that on auto. That allows us to do AF handoffs and things like that, which is kind of beyond the scope of this video, but is definitely covered in the book. But just leave it on auto for now. Limit AF area mode selection. I love this one. We have a ton of different AF areas in this camera. And my guess, if you're like me, you're not going to use all those AF areas. So when you're changing AF areas, it's kind of a pain to cycle through all of these different AF areas, right? So you can come in here and you can shut these off if you want. Pinpoint AF, I'm going to shut off, even though it's an AFS thing and I never use AFS. Still just, the principle of it. I don't usually use any of my dynamic areas. Maybe I should, but I don't. We have our wide, small, and wide, large, C1 and C2 if you're using those custom wide areas. 3D and auto, I'm going to leave all that on, and that's it. So now when I cycle through my AF areas, I'm not going to have to go through all those dynamic AF areas anymore. I can just kind of skip those, and I don't have to worry about pinpoint. But you cannot disable single point AF because it's the rock star of the AF area modes as far as I'm concerned. I know. It sounds strange, but it is. It's my favorite. Focus point wraparound, I keep that off. Basically what that's going to do is if you're moving your AF point and it gets to the edge of the viewfinder, top or bottom, it'll flip to the other side if it's on. That confuses me because I'm a simple guy, so I leave this off. Focus point display, I leave these defaults on, but I do go down to AFC in focus display and I turn that on because it's my hero. Basically what this does, if you're in AFS mode, which if you're a wildlife photographer, get out of that right now. But if you're in AFS mode and you're out there kind of photographing something, when it's sharp, that AF area, whichever one you're using there, is going to turn green. It's going to go from red to green. If you're in AFC mode, by default, with this off, that AF area just stays red all the time. So if you're in like single point AF or wide AF and you focus on something in AFC mode, it's just going to stay red. I like an indicator, so this is going to turn that green. So definitely turn this on. You're gonna love it. 3D tracking focus point color is white. I like red. What can I say? I go in here and change it. Leave it if you want, but not a big deal one way or the other. Built-in AF AssistIlluminator. I just shut it off. It's kind of an AFS thing, but I just don't want to accidentally be in AFS one day photographing a grizzly bear and then, I don't know, have a light come shining at him. I think it's probably something you can ignore if you're just using AFC anyway. But anyway, moving on. Focus peaking. I like to turn this on and I like to turn it up. So I go to focus peaking. I have it on. Peaking sensitivity, I turn it all the way up to 3. And I just leave the highlight color in red. You can try blue or white or whatever you like there. But basically what this is going to do, whatever color you have selected here, when you're manually focusing your lens, you're grabbing your manual focus ring, focusing the lens, what this is going to do is it's going to paint the sharp areas, whatever color that you select here. So it's a very good manual focus assist because the more paint you have on an area, the sharper that area is. It's basically looking at contrast. And I turn it all the way up and I have it set like this for a very specific reason. And believe it or not, most of the time it's not because I'm manually focusing. Most of the time it's because sometimes I hit the focus ring of my lens on accident. And when I do that, I jump into manual focus override mode. And with peaking on, I can see that I messed up. With peaking off, I might be pressing this AF on button, like crazy, and the camera's not focusing, and I don't realize that I've accidentally pressed this, and I'm taking a bunch of soft photos. With focus peaking on, when I accidentally press this, suddenly I see that paint all over my subject, and I know I need to release my AF on button and then press it again and re-engage autofocus and keep my fingers away from that darn ring. So that's my main use for this, kind of as an early warning system if I've accidentally brushed against my manual focus ring. So let's go back. Focus point selection speed. I have it at normal right now. If you feel like when you're using the joystick or whatever, it's zipping around too fast, go to low. If you feel like it's too slow, go to high. There you go. Manual focus ring in AF mode. This is an on or off switch, and basically it lets you turn off the focus ring on the camera. You're not going to see this option if you don't have a dedicated focus ring on your lens. If you just have a control ring that's being used for focus, like with a 180 to 600, then you're not going to see this. However, if you do have a dedicated focus ring, like I do here and on a lot of my other lenses, you will, and you can click that, turn it off, and then you will no longer be accidentally manually focusing. Sometimes I'll turn this off if I'm really bumping that area a lot, like if I'm shooting from a vehicle and everything's clumsy, you know. But for the most part, I leave that on because there's times I do need to manually focus something, and it's nice to have that override option. And I don't want to be panicking because I can't manually focus. I have to come in the menu. It's like, where is that? I do like having the override. Okay, so moving on to the metering and exposure portion of our setup guide here. We're going to go down to the first thing I change here is matrix metering face detection. I just shut that off. Basically, that's for people, but I just don't want any unexpected results with animals, so I shut it off. I don't think it's a problem one way or the other, but hey, I'm here, right? Go down next to the keep exposure when f-stop changes option. This one's a little bit complicated, but it's really, really cool, especially if you're using manual exposure, believe it or not. The thing is, what happens sometimes is we have a variable zoom lens. Maybe we have like an f4 to 5.6, or maybe we have a TC lens, like my 600 TC, where you flip in the teleconverter. So we have an effective change of f-stop when I flip in the TC and when I take it out, or when I'm zooming a lens in and out. So what this will do is this will make an adjustment for us when we're in manual exposure so that we don't have to worry about that reciprocity there. So for example, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to tell it to change ISO sensitivity. And let's say I'm using my 600 TC and I'm in full manual mode. Now, if I'm in manual with auto ISO, I'm controlling the shutter speed, I'm controlling the f-stop. So when I switch from f4 to f5.6, the camera, since it's in auto ISO, automatically adjusts for that. So that's not a problem. But let's say I'm in full manual mode. This is where I think wildlife photographers will find this handy. So let's say I'm using my 600 f4, I'm at ISO 400, and I say, okay, I need the teleconverter in. So I flip that in. That changes it to f5.6. Or let's say I'm using a zoom lens and I'm at f4 and I zoom out and it goes to 5.6. Either way this works. So rather than having to make that manual compensation on the spot and say, oh, I'm at ISO 400 and I need to be at 800 now, and rather than going in and messing with ISO or turning my control ring to change ISO, that's how I have it set. I'll show you that in the next video. But rather than doing that, the camera will automatically just say, oh, the f-stop changed. Here's the reciprocal ISO for that. So it'll go from 400 to 800 when I go from 4 to 5.6 automatically. And when I go from 5.6 back down to f4, it'll drop the ISO by a stop for me there too. Same with zooming in and out. So it's a very, very handy feature, especially if you're shooting in manual exposure mode. And I do that quite a bit. So I like to make sure that this is turned on and I have it set to ISO. I want to adjust the ISO when I do that. Okay, so moving on, we have timers and AE lock. I don't do anything with AE lock, I leave that off. Self-timer though, I do have a little trick. So I set my delay to 5 seconds, my number of shots to 5, and my interval between shots I leave at the 0.5 second mark there. And here's my trick. What I like to do with the self-timer sometimes, the stars have to align here a little bit for you, but what I like to do with the self-timer sometimes is if I have an especially static subject in especially low light, he's holding very still. There's no wind blowing trees. There's no, I'm on a tripod. And maybe the only way to get this exposure is if I knock my shutter speed down to like 15th of a second, 1/8 of a second, something ridiculously slow, right? So what I'll do is I'll set the camera up. I'll carefully focus on his eye. I'll set the self-timer and I'll press my button. I'll put my hands up like this, like I'm surrendering, so I'm not touching the camera. The camera will count down 5 seconds, then I'll shoot 5 exposures, a half a second apart, of that animal. And most of the time, I'm going to have at least 1 or 2 in there that's absolutely tack sharp. And if nothing moved at all, I'll have all 5 of them nice and sharp. But, animals breathe and they, that maybe there is a little tiny wind or something, or they're leaning or something, but this will compensate for that. And this works really well. But again, stars have to completely align for that to work. Next, we have power off delay. Right now, I have my menus actually set to 10 minutes because I'm doing this video. This is the only setting I changed in here because I wanted to walk you through the rest of them there. But normally, I would set this to something like 1 minute or 5 minutes or something for menus. 5 minutes if you're doing your initial setup, but maybe, bring it down to 1 minute or so afterwards. Whatever works for you is good. For me, my standby timer, though, I like to change that. 30 seconds, I don't like the camera shutting off so quick. Sometimes I'm looking at the back of it. Sometimes I'm looking through the LCD, and I don't want it just shutting off. I don't want to have to constantly wake up, wake up, wake up. So I set this to 5 minutes. And obviously I'm going to take a little bit of hit on battery life there. Very good at shutting my camera off when I'm not using it, so I think this works out really well. I'm going to go back over here, and let's go down to the Shooting and Display menu. This is a big one. Hold your breath, or take a deep breath, or something. So I don't change that. Maximum shots per burst, I do change from 200 to infinity. And the reason I do that is simple, is that this camera with its bottomless buffer, at least with a fast CF Express card, is really handy if you have like a prolonged action sequence. There's times that, if you're doing 200 shots, granted that's like 10 seconds, but there are times in the wildlife world that, stuff goes on for longer than 10 seconds, and I realize I can just release the shutter and start shooting again, but I don't want to miss any shots. I like to, one of my rules, I've said this to you guys before, one of my rules is if you see something good in your viewfinder, just keep shooting. Don't stop. Lay on that shutter. I see so many people kind of let up because they feel like they've shot too much, then they miss the best moments. So I have that set to infinity. I don't know that I really ever much go over 200 shots anyway, but I want the option. Now, the disadvantage here, of course, is if you put this in your camera bag and something presses a button, it's going to fill up your card and not, it's going to keep shooting until your card's full. So, hit OK, back out. Pre-release capture. I don't use pre-release capture because it's all JPEG, and I'm not a big fan of JPEG. So I don't use it on this camera. I don't use pre-release. But if you want to use it, you have some setup options in here. You can turn it on, and you can say, hey, how long? Usually half a second is plenty. Maybe 0.3 seconds is really adequate. And I leave the post-release burst to max. It's a silly little setting. Basically, if you have that set down to something else, so like 3 seconds, if like a bird takes off and you're trying to follow it, after 3, 2, or 1 seconds, depending on what you set here, the camera just stops, and you can't keep shooting. You have to take your finger up and start shooting again. Leave it on max. But anyway, again, I don't use that. But if you want more details for how to use that, it's going to be in the setup guide. I do go over it pretty thoroughly in there and give you all the ins and outs of using pre-release capture there. But for our setup video here today, we're just going to kind of breeze. Let's see, exposure limit, I don't use that for wildlife. But if you ever find yourself in a situation, this will basically tell the camera to wait 3, 2, 1.5, 0.2 seconds, whatever, after you press the shutter before it releases the shutter. So if you ever find yourself in a situation where the camera's acting weird and like I press the shutter and nothing happens for 2 seconds, check here. Might be your self-timer, but it might be this too. And this is kind of handy sometimes, though, if you're like on a tripod and you want to you can use this kind of like the self-timer thing I just talked about. You can set it for 3 seconds, press it, let it go. I sometimes do this with macros. Just depends, but for the most part, I keep that off. Shutter type, we have several options. Basically, the ones we're interested in are auto and electronic shutter, maybe electronic first curtain too. If basically the two that I tend to use is auto or electronic. Most of the time I have this set to electronic because I find it works really, really well. But if I'm in a situation where I'm worried about rolling shutter, I'm shooting hummingbirds or swallows or something that's flapping its wings, honestly, the best way to do that is just set it to auto. Not all lenses actually support mechanical shutter. Apparently this one does not, because you can see it's grayed out here on the menu. So auto will go ahead and go into mechanical shutter if you go to like continuous high normal, not the extended one with a little star, but just continuous high normal. Drop it to there, put it in auto, you'll get your mechanical shutter, or it'll switch to electronic first curtain. It'll use whatever appropriate. So that's pretty cool. But for me, I just got to go down to electronic shutter because I like to use that, and it's worked out really well for me. Plus, it lets me go into complete silent mode if I need to. I don't use extended shutter speeds. I don't limit my selectable image area. That's the FXDX 1:1. If I want to pick one of these, there's not like a lot of them here. I don't see any reason to uncheck any of those unless you like have some grudge against 1:1 ratios or 16:9 ratios. Let's see here. Video mode, photo live view, I recommend leaving show effects and settings in place. You can adjust this for ease of viewing. Basically, that's not going to show you what your settings are doing. It's just going to make a pleasant viewfinder experience. But I would just leave this at show effects of settings for most things. I do go over in the book some examples of when you might want to use this, but as I say, basically try to appeal to most people setting this up and give you the basic setup here. Starlight View, honestly, Starlight View is kind of weird now because this goes down to -10 EV. So I don't know, I didn't use it much or at all in the past. I definitely don't see any reason to use it now. But if weird things are happening with your camera, sometimes this is the reason. I've seen some troubleshooting problems or weird stuff's happening. Make sure that's shut off if the camera's acting odd. Warm display colors, leave them off. LCD illumination, leave it off. View all in continuous mode. This is a weird one. Leave it on. If you shut this off, basically the idea is that if you shut this off and you're in continuous mode and you fire a burst, the viewfinder is going to go completely black. You're not going to see what you're shooting. I know it sounds weird. Apparently, it's to conserve battery life on multi-camera setups. So you have a camera here and you have 5 of them over there. You put them all, the external cameras on view all in continuous mode. Shut that off, and then it'll save, I don't know, 2 minutes of battery life over the course of a year or something. I don't know. It seems silly to me. Release timing indicator. This is another one. I don't know what the point of this is, because we have the way our continuous advance works in this camera. If you're on continuous high extended, you're basically getting a slideshow. It's, again, very hard to detect, but you're basically getting a slideshow, and you can kind of tell when you're shooting. If you're in one of the normal modes, you don't really need a release indicator because you see a blackout between the frames. You don't need a little white line coming around it to show you that you're taking a photo. You can kind of see it. So for me, I just leave all this at the default. Image frame is on. That's the little outline around the viewfinder. I like that on. I think it looks cool. Grid type. I like a 3x3. I'm a kind of a traditionalist. I'll go with the rule of thirds grid in there. But if you want to go crazy, you go 4x4 or 5x4 or 1:1, 16:9. So any of these kind of help. Sometimes you might want to throw one of these, change it up if you're like looking for a specific ratio that you're trying to crop to, and you don't want to go to that particular crop mode. You just want to see what it looks like there. I guess you could change it, but I recommend just 3x3. By the way, there's a trick for these grids. You can't actually see these grids unless you do something that's coming up here in the next step. Well, the next step after this one. Because first, we have to set our virtual horizon type. So let's go to type A or B. If you want to feel like you're a fighter pilot, I'm not judging you, but if you want to feel like you're a fighter pilot, go to type A. I am more of a type B kind of guy. Monitor, let's see, customize monitor shooting display. We have a lot of options in here, and if you look through them, none of them have a grid, right? So we have to do something about that. But basically, I'll show you that in a second. But basically, what this does is it allows you to just check and uncheck which displays you want to see when you press, by default, your display button. Now, we're going to reassign that because this is a good spot for a lot of stuff, but displaying it. But basically, when you cycle through your display modes, when you're looking, in this case for the monitor, but this works the same for the viewfinder. When you're cycling through those display modes and you're getting those different layouts, this is where you control how many screens you have and what you see on those screens. And this is completely customizable. So, for example, this is for the back screen here. This is the monitor. So, like, I don't like this particular screen here with all of the f-stops and the, all of my settings on it. I don't care. I know what those settings are. I can look in the viewfinder and see those settings. I set them. I know what they are. So I shut that one off. So that way I'm not cycling through it. Now the rest of these, I usually only use a couple of these, but for right now I'm just going to kind of breeze through this. You guys can set it up however you want. But if you want to customize these a little bit more. So display one, I like my first display to have everything. I want to see it all. So I'm going to hit the right side of the multi-selector. And then I'm going to go through and check every box. So I have the simple view. I have the detailed view. I have the touch controls view. I have the virtual horizon. You see those come on right there. I have the histogram. I just turned it on. You can see that. Here's the framing grid that we set back a couple of steps ago. This is the only way you can see these grids. They are not on by default. If you can set whatever grid you want all day long, but if you don't turn it on in this menu and the next menu, you're not going to see them. Again, this one here, what we're doing is for the back monitor here. And I like to have my little center indicator. And let's see, the center weighted area, if I happen to be shooting center weighted metering, which is pretty rare. So that one has everything on it, which is really cool. But then I can set these other ones up. So let's say I'm looking at display 2, and I like what I'm seeing, but I maybe want to see a histogram and a grid. There we go. Go back. And there's display 3. And maybe I want a little bit plainer view. I don't want a grid there. And here's display 4. Maybe I want that nice clean look there. And I do like this one sometimes. And I don't put a grid on. I don't put anything. That way, if I'm just kind of in a simple situation where I'm just doing really want to see everything that's uncluttered, I like to have that in there. So again, you can set these up however you want. I give you some examples in the guidebook that's coming out in that. But anyhow, this is for the monitor. And the viewfinder works exactly the same way. We can come in, for example, this is going to be what I see in my viewfinder. There's not as many options here. We only have 4 of them. But honestly, I don't even know if you need 4 of them. I usually have 1 or 2 of these off. I'm not going to set these up completely right now. Again, I go over this in the book as far as what I really like. But I always have one that has everything here. So there we go. I have everything there. And then maybe I'll take this simpler one here and just put a grid. I always like having those grids in there. But anyhow, that's how you do it. And you just set those whatever you like there. And you can then cycle through with the display button to do them. Some people will just set up the monitor and the viewfinder exactly the way they want with one layout. and then they don't worry about programming anything for changing displays. And that's totally fine. I like to change displays a little bit. I do go back and forth, especially on a camera like this. It has a little bit of a limit when it comes to buttons. You don't have as many buttons on this camera as like I do on a Z8 or a Z9. So sometimes I think about maybe I should just pick a display for each one of these screens, the viewfinder and the back LCD, and just use that. Don't use anything else. Shut the rest of them off, and then not worry about programming a button for display. So that's just, a thought. Next, we have the high frames per second viewfinder display. I like to turn that on, even though it eats a little more battery. I like a fast viewfinder display. I think it works a little better if you're trying to shoot action. And then I don't do anything with bracketing or flash, so we're going to go right through there. Oh, we are in the controls menu, and that means we are also at the end of our video. So thank you for watching today. Really, really appreciate it, and I hope you join me on video number 4. You've made it this far. You might as well watch the next one because it's probably like the best one. It's really the one you've been looking for. I'm going to show you how I set up my controls. So as always, though, thank you for watching. Have a great day.